Yes.
like names and identities.
Street whore.
What does that tell you? It tells you that at least one witness is unreliable, or perhaps all of them are.
Slut.
It tells you that what you are hearing
China.
is not pure memory, but reconstruction, shaped by time, by motive, by the needs of the moment. Open any Bible and turn to Matthew chapter 10, verses 2 through 4. There it is, the list. 12 names presented as historical fact.
God damn it.
Now turn to Mark
11
chapter 3,
motherfucking minutes.
verses 16 through 19.
Fuck that shit.
Different order. Some different names.
You son of a
Now,
bitch.
Luke chapter 6, verses 14 through 16. Still more differences. And John? John never gives you a complete list at all. He mentions certain disciples, as his narrative requires them. But he never assembles all 12 in one place. Never a definitive roll call of the men who supposedly shared every miracle,
motherfucking shit.
every whispered prayer with the Son of God for 3 years of their lives. If these men were real, if they truly walked with Jesus, ate beside him, witnessed him calm the sea, then why can the people who wrote about them not agree on who they were? You were taught that these are insignificant details, harmless variations. But Spinoza asked a far more unsettling question.
Come
What
on,
if
you
the gospel
slut.
writers were not remembering at all? What if they were constructing? What if the number
Come on,
12
motherfucker.
mattered infinitely more than the actual human beings who
Come
supposedly
on,
composed it?
motherfucker.
That question cost Spinoza everything. The Catholic Church placed his work on the
Goddamn
Index of
motherfucker.
Forbidden Books, where it sat for centuries. Christian authorities condemned him as an atheist, though he was nothing of the sort. He died in 1677 at 44, alone in a boarding house in The Hague. His lungs destroyed by years of inhaling glass dust from the
Suck my
lenses he
dick,
ground
bitch.
to earn his living. But he died knowing what he had uncovered was true.
Come
And
on,
now,
you goddamn motherfucker.
3.5 centuries later, you are going to see it for yourself. Think about it carefully. 12
Goddamn
tribes of
motherfucker.
Israel, descended from 12 sons of Jacob, forming the entire architecture of God's covenant
Bad
with his chosen
stupid
people.
motherfucker.
12 patriarchs, whose names were carved into the collective memory of a civilization. 12
Now fuck
precious
up and read
stones
this
on the
bitch
breastplate
right
of the high
here.
priest.
I can hear you.
12 foundations of the New Jerusalem described in Revelation.
Yes.
The holy city,
Man, that
descending from heaven at the end of time. The number 12 runs through Jewish and early Christian tradition not as an accident of counting, but as a structural beam, a load-bearing pillar in the entire theological edifice. It is symbolic, powerful,
Damn motherfucker.
and absolutely essential.
So,
When the early church set about establishing Jesus as the fulfillment of everything the Hebrew Scriptures had promised, as the new covenant replacing the old, as the Messiah who would restore Israel through spiritual transformation, what better way to make that claim unmistakable than to surround him with 12 new patriarchs, 12 new foundations, mirroring the 12 tribes, signaling to every Jewish listener that this was the moment their scriptures had been pointing toward for centuries? The number had to be 12, not 11, not 13, not however
You
many people
suck,
actually
motherfucking
traveled with
dick.
Jesus during his ministry. Even if they had to invent people to reach that number, even if they had to fill empty chairs with names pulled from the air and written into sacred texts, as though those names had always belonged there. And here's where the evidence becomes almost impossible to ignore.
Suck my
When
dick.
Judas Iscariot died, there were only 11 apostles remaining. And what did the surviving disciples do?
You stupid
According to the first
motherfucker.
chapter of Acts, they did not
You
mourn
stupid
or
bitch.
pause to reflect. They held an emergency meeting. They organized a lottery. They cast lots between two candidates and selected Matthias to fill the empty slot before Pentecost, before the Holy Spirit descended, before their ministry had officially begun. Why the urgency? What was so catastrophically wrong with being 11? The answer is
Suck my
devastatingly simple.
motherfucking dick, bitch.
11 apostles would shatter the parallel to the 12 tribes. It would undermine the entire theological architecture
You
like
what
a
a stupid
cathedral with one
motherfucker.
pillar missing. The whole structure would lean and invite the eye to notice the gap rather than admire the design.
Cunt.
So they plugged the hole with Matthias, a
Suck
man
my
who appears in exactly one passage in the entire New Testament. He speaks no recorded words. He performs no miracles. He contributes no teachings
Now
and
fuck
plays
up
no
and bring this
role
palm
in the
down
explosive
through
growth
space
of
and
the
suck
early
it
church
up. Shut the
that
fuck
Acts
up.
describes in vivid detail.
Suck my dick.
After his selection, Matthias vanishes from Christian history as completely as if he had never been born. Does that sound like a real person chosen by divine lottery to carry the most important message in human history? Or does that sound like a name written into a margin to keep a number intact? Now, let us turn to the names you have never been able to remember. The disciples who drift through the Gospels like ghosts. Start with James, son of Alphaeus.
Suck my
Try to
motherfucking
recall a single thing about him. One sermon he preached. One question he asked Jesus. One moment of courage or doubt that would make him feel like a person who actually existed.
Suck my
You
dick.
cannot, because there is nothing to recall. In all four Gospels, James, son of Alphaeus, contributes exactly 0 words. He performs 0 actions. He appears in Matthew chapter 10, Mark chapter 3.
Yeah,
Luke
and
chapter
Sergeant,
6,
the persecutor,
and Acts
he named
chapter
a
1:4
shitload of men who
mentions
worked in the special
all
forces, but
roster
now
entries.
he has
Not
several
one of them
who
a
do
scene
that, who
or
do
a
not
conversation.
jack shit.
He is a
Get
line
mentioned
on
in
a
the book.
form, a checkbox marked to satisfy a requirement. Spinoza noticed this with the sharp eye of a man who had nothing left to lose. He observed that some disciples are genuine characters with personalities and arcs. Peter denies Jesus 3 times and weeps bitterly. A scene so achingly human, it has echoed through 20 centuries of art. Thomas refuses to believe the resurrection until he touches the wounds, capturing the universal struggle between faith and evidence.
Fuck.
John is the beloved disciple, tender and loyal. Judas betrays with a kiss theatrical, devastating, unforgettable. These are people with weight and dimension and the unmistakable texture of lived experience. But James, son of Alphaeus, Bartholomew, Simon, the Zealot, they are names and nothing more, placeholders occupying slots, so the count would reach 12. Now add Thaddeus to that list, and watch the construction become even more transparent. Matthew and Mark both include a disciple called Thaddeus, but when you turn to Luke and Acts, that name has disappeared entirely. In its place sits Judas, son of James. Same position in the list, same slot in the roster, completely different name. The traditional explanation is that they were the same person operating under 2 names. The way Simon was also called Peter. That sounds reasonable until you examine it closely. Peter is always explicitly identified as having 2 names. The text itself says Simon, who is called Peter. The dual identity is explained and woven into the narrative. Thaddeus and Judas, son of James, receive no such treatment. They are simply different names, occupying the same structural position in different Gospels. As if the writers knew they needed a 12th name for that particular chair, but could not agree on what to write on the nameplate, as if they were filling in blanks on a template. Reaching for whatever sounded plausible, trusting that no one would ever lay the lists side by side and notice the substitution. Spinoza laid them side by side. He noticed, and what he realized reshaped everything about how we understand these texts. If you strip away the names that appear only in lists, if you remove every disciple who never speaks or performs a single action, if you set aside the names that shift between Gospels like reflections in troubled water.
Come on, you dick.
You are left with roughly 6 actual characters: Peter, John, Matthew, Thomas, Philip, Andrew. 6 people with stories, with voices, with narrative substance, suggesting someone genuinely remembered them. The other 6 exist only to complete a number that mattered more than any man who supposedly filled it. Now watch what happens when you pull on the next thread. Bartholomew appears in the lists in Matthew, Mark, and Luke dutifully occupying his slot,
God damn it.
saying nothing, doing nothing. But when you turn to the Gospel of John,
Well, if you saved that
composed
motherfucker
perhaps
up,
as late
I'm a
as
dick if you
110 of the Common Era, Bartholomew is gone. Instead, John introduces a disciple named Nathanael, a man who appears in one vivid scene near the beginning, exchanges words with
Movie
Jesus beneath a fig tree, and then vanishes
I'm
almost
fucking
entirely.
you up.
He is not mentioned in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. He exists only in John, occupying roughly the same narrative space where Bartholomew sits in the other 3 Gospels. The traditional explanation has been repeated so often, it feels like settled fact. Bartholomew and Nathanael are the same person, different name, same man. But consider what that requires you to ignore. John was written last. If Bartholomew was truly one of the 12, if that name was established and circulating in the communities that produced the earlier Gospels, why would John's author call him something completely different? Why deliberately introduce confusion? Unless John did not know about Bartholomew at all. Unless Bartholomew was added to earlier lists after John was already circulating, or unless John was working from a completely different oral tradition, because the names were never fixed, never historical, never based on consistent memory of real individuals. They were being assembled and revised across decades as the Gospels were written,
God
rewritten,
damn it.
and copied by communities with different needs. Now, consider Simon the Zealot, and watch an even more revealing crack appear. The Gospels call him Simon the Zealot, or Simon the Canaanite, depending on which manuscript your Bible follows. The label sounds straightforward. Simon belonged to the Zealots, a Jewish revolutionary group opposed to Roman occupation. The inclusion seems designed to show the diversity of Jesus' followers, that even political radicals found a place at his table. A beautiful theological point. There is just one devastating problem. Jesus died around 30 of the Common Era. The Zealots, as a recognized, organized movement, did not exist until decades later. They rose to prominence during the Jewish War against Rome, which erupted in 66 CE and ended with the temple's destruction in 70 CE. The term zealot, as a political identity, belonged to that later period, a word carrying specific weight for people living through or remembering the Jewish war, not for people in the Galilee of the 20s and 30s. You see what happened? Whoever wrote that name was writing from a time when zealot meant something specific and politically charged. They projected that identity backward onto a figure in Jesus' circle
Come on, you
to make a
dicko.
theological point. It is an anachronism, a detail belonging to a later era embedded in an earlier story. Like finding a wristwatch in a medieval painting. Spinoza caught this. He recognized that the Gospels are filled with these quiet timestamps, references that only make sense if the author was writing long after the events described, after the temple fell, after the diaspora, after Christianity needed to explain itself to audiences who had never set foot in Palestine. Simon the Zealot is not a historical person remembered from Jesus' ministry. He is a character invented to serve a narrative purpose. And the label attached to his name betrays the period of his creation. The same pattern emerges with the second James, sometimes called James the Less. Why the Less? Less important than the other James? Shorter? Younger? Nobody knows, because the label is not biographical. It is a filing system, existing solely to distinguish this James from James, son of Zebedee. But when one of two people sharing a name in a group of 12 contributes absolutely nothing, no words, no actions,
Come on, you dicko.
no narrative presence, the obvious conclusion is that he was invented to fill a slot. James was common enough in first century Palestine that having two would not immediately raise suspicion. Except it does. Once you start paying attention. Now, add Judas Iscariot to the list
get
of
rid of that
problems.
fucking whore.
You are thinking Judas certainly existed.
Suck
He
my
is the
motherfucking
betrayer.
dick.
The villain whose kiss delivered Jesus to execution. But look closer.
Suck my motherfucking
Iscariot
dick.
is not a surname. Scholars have argued for centuries about its meaning. Man from Kerioth. Some suggest
Suck my motherfucking dick.
Sicarius, a type of assassin, say others. Oswan,
So
in
fucking
Hebrew,
Christ.
propose still more. No consensus exists, because the word is probably not a real identifier at all. It is a label grafted onto the character to distinguish this Judas from the other Judas in the lists. And consider how he dies. In Matthew, Judas is consumed by remorse, throws the blood money at the priests, and hangs himself. In Acts, he buys a field with that money, falls headlong, and his body bursts open with his intestines spilling onto the ground. Two completely different deaths. Two irreconcilable accounts. You were taught these could be harmonized. Perhaps he hanged himself and then fell. But Spinoza asked the sharper question. What if different writers invented different endings for a character whose narrative function, the necessary betrayal, mattered far more than biographical accuracy? Because these texts are solving a theological problem that haunted the early church. If Jesus was divine and omniscient, why did he allow betrayal? The constructed answer was that it had to happen. Prophesied, ordained, woven into God's plan. Judas was not a traitor exercising free will, but a tool fulfilling a cosmic role. They made him as villainous as possible, gave him motivations of greed and demonic possession, then killed him dramatically to satisfy the audience's hunger for justice. But the contradictions in how he dies reveal the seams of that construction. Places where different storytellers stitched different solutions onto the same problem without coordinating carefully enough. Judas Iscariot, as a verifiable historical person, is almost impossible to confirm. What we have is a character performing a theological function, a name carrying a betrayal the story required. And when he was gone, they replaced him immediately with Matthias, who never appears again, because they needed 12, always 12, no matter the cost. Let us go deeper now. Let us look at what happens when you actually read these texts as documents with authors and agendas. Instead of divine pronouncements delivered from heaven on golden plates, the Gospel of Mark was written first, probably around 70 of the Common Era, roughly 40 years after Jesus died. Matthew came next, somewhere between 80 and 90 CE. Luke was composed around the same. The Gospel of Mark was written first, probably around 70 of the Common Era, roughly 40 years after Jesus died. Matthew came next, somewhere between 80 and 90 CE. Luke was composed around the same period, drawing heavily on Mark as a source while adding material from other traditions. John came last, possibly as late as 110 CE, a full 80 years after the events it describes. None of them were written by eyewitnesses. None of them were composed by the disciples whose names they carry. This is not a radical claim whispered by atheists in dark corners. This is the mainstream consensus of biblical scholarship. accepted by historians at every major university and seminary in the world. The Gospels are anonymous texts. They circulated without author names for decades until sometime in the 2nd century. Church leaders attributed them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to give them apostolic authority and settle disputes about which texts should be trusted. So, when the author of Matthew lists 12 disciples in chapter 10, he is not pulling out a personal journal and writing down the names of men he traveled with. He is sitting in a room decades after the fact, working from Mark's earlier gospel and from oral traditions circulating in his community, constructing a narrative about who should have been there. And his construction is deliberate. Matthew's list is not random or chronological. It is arranged in careful pairs, Peter and Andrew first, James and John second, organized by importance and theological significance. It is a hierarchy, an organizational chart, a structure imposed on history by a writer with a specific audience and a specific purpose. Matthew was writing primarily for Jewish readers, people steeped in the traditions of the Hebrew Scriptures. His entire gospel is designed to demonstrate that Jesus fulfilled Old Testament prophecy at every turn. So his 12 disciples function as replacement patriarchs for the 12 tribes, a new Israel gathered around a new Moses, delivering a new law from a new mountain. Every choice in his list serves that theological architecture. Mark's list is different. Luke's list is different still. They are all organizing the 12 differently because they are all serving different purposes and speaking to different communities. Luke was writing for Gentile audiences, people unfamiliar with the tribal structure of Israel. So he emphasizes the unity and equal standing of the disciples rather than their hierarchical arrangement. John abandons the formal list entirely. He does not care about the number 12 as a structural device, because his gospel operates on a different theological wavelength, focused on mystical union with the divine, rather than institutional succession. He mentions disciples as his narrative needs them, names some, ignores others, and never once assembles the complete roster that the other 3 Gospels treat as essential. These writers were not 4 journalists covering the same press conference from different angles. They were theologians, composing narratives for communities separated by geography, culture, language, and decades of evolving belief. They were not reporting. They were composing. And Spinoza saw this clearly because he read them without the paralyzing assumption that they had to agree. Now think about what this means for you personally. Think about what it reveals about the guilt you have carried since childhood. If you grew up in church, you sat through lessons where teachers presented the 12 disciples as historical bedrock, 12 specific men who answered Jesus' call and changed the world. You were given charts with their names. You were quizzed. You were expected to recite them on demand. And when you stumbled over Thaddeus, or mixed up the 2 men named James, you felt something, a small, sharp pang of spiritual inadequacy, as though your inability to memorize a list reflected some deeper failure of devotion. That feeling was not an accident. It was the system working exactly as designed, teaching children to memorize names that were themselves fabricated, punishing them with guilt when their memories could not hold on to information that never cohered in the first place. That is not education. That is conditioning. It is training a mind to accept what authority declares without examining it. It is teaching you that your confusion is a sin rather than a sign of intelligence. Think about what that does to a child's developing mind. You are 7 years old, sitting in a classroom with construction paper, apostles taped to the wall, and your teacher asks you to name all 12. You get through Peter, John, Matthew, Andrew, Thomas, maybe Philip, and then you stop. The other names will not come because they have no stories attached to them, no memorable moments, no human substance that would make them stick in a young brain hungry for narrative and meaning. Your teacher tells you to study harder. Your parents tell you to pray about it. And you internalize the message that the problem is you, your laziness, your lack of faith, your insufficient devotion. But the problem was never you. The problem was that you were being asked to memorize a list that was never meant to be historical. It was meant to be symbolic. Your mind was doing exactly what a healthy, intelligent mind should do, rejecting information that does not cohere, refusing to store data that contradicts itself, resisting a pattern that makes no narrative sense. Your confusion was not failure. It was wisdom trying to break through years of conditioning, and they punished you for it. Consider the larger patterns Spinoza identified. Names that change between gospels. Names attached to people who never speak or act. Names that appear once and dissolve into permanent silence. This is not how human beings record lived experience. When you spend 3 years traveling with a group of people, sharing meals and sleeping under the same stars, you do not forget who was there. You do not mix up their names. You do not need 4 separate attempts to compile an accurate list. But when you are building a symbolic structure decades after the fact, when you need exactly 12 names to complete a theological parallel, when the number matters infinitely more than the individuals, then you get precisely what the Gospels give us: inconsistency, contradiction, ghost names filling empty chairs. Spinoza understood that these contradictions were not flaws in an otherwise reliable record. They were fingerprints left behind by the architects of a constructed narrative. Evidence that the lists were assembled to serve purposes that had nothing to do with preserving accurate memories of real human beings who walked the roads of Galilee with a carpenter from Nazareth. 6 disciples who probably never existed. 6 names added to reach a sacred number. 6 placeholders in a list that was built not to record history, but to fulfill prophecy and establish authority. And you memorized them. You were tested on them. You were made to feel spiritually inadequate if you could not recall them all on command. But here is what you really need to understand: what Spinoza risked his community, his safety, his family, and ultimately his life to show you. It is not about the disciples. It was never about the disciples. It is about what their invention reveals. If the early church was willing to fabricate half the apostle list just to reach a symbolic number, what else were they willing to fabricate? If they constructed lists of witnesses to Jesus' ministry, if they invented human beings and gave them names and embedded them in sacred texts that billions of people across 2 millennia would read as literal truth, what does that tell you about their relationship to truth itself? It tells you that truth was never the highest priority. Control was. Conformity was. Building a narrative so seamless and so sacred that questioning any part of it would feel like questioning God himself, that was the goal. Not accuracy, not honesty, not a faithful record of what actually happened on the shores of the Sea of Galilee in the first decades of the Common Era. The goal was a foundation that could not be examined.
Damn it.
A structure that would endure, not because it was true, but because challenging it was treated as a crime against the divine. They did not merely invent disciples. They invented the sin of questioning disciples. They built institutions vast, wealthy, politically powerful institutions spanning continents and centuries that would systematically hunt down anyone who did what you are doing right now. Looking at the evidence, comparing the texts, asking the devastatingly simple question that every honest mind eventually arrives at: does this actually make sense? Spinoza was excommunicated not for being wrong. He was excommunicated.
Atheists, they don't rationally believe in hell. They're still having nightmares. They still will have a fear when someone dies. It will still show up for them emotionally. And so actually the bigger part of this work is rewiring your brain, working with this fear, a lot of emotional work, because this was pre-rational. You probably got these beliefs handed down to you when you were a child, and they are wired as fear memories. And so just logically going through the history of hell historically is not going to be enough for your brain to just be like, oh, I'm totally done. I never think about my fear of hell again. Usually the emotional side takes more time than the logical side. The logical, rational piece of just saying who the hell knows, because these scriptures are just like really contradictory and it's all over the place. That part's actually easy. It's really easy to get through that part. The emotional work is where you're actually having to rewire your brain.
Damn it.
So what that looks like is first of all, just knowing when they got these beliefs as a child, and we really go back to how it was presented to them as a child, because we have your prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that's handling the rational belief. We can go through that fairly quickly when you do the history, but the amygdala is where it stores your fear memories. And so you have this, I have it with clients all the time, where rationally they really don't think that there's a God that's going to throw them in hell for leaving their church, but emotionally their body is acting like they do believe that. And they're kind of split-brained in that way, which makes sense because these are two different parts of the brain. We can't actually erase a fear memory, we have to create new neural pathways, and that's where the real work is. And so one of the first things that we do is we will re-encode these symbols. So the brain doesn't stay afraid of something that it learns how to play with. And so we're going to actually, in your brain, we'll bring up whatever the imagery was when you were a child. Let's say that it's fire, or let's say that it's Jesus coming down and it's earthquakes, whatever that imagery was. And we're going to actually move your brain into a new thought there. And so here's an example that I keep on my wall. This is, if you can see, this is Velociraptor in the Velociraptor. And it's just something silly. It's so silly. And yet it is actually very effective for your brain to take something like, it's silly, it's so silly. And yet it is actually very effective for your brain to take something like fire, for example, that feels really scary in your body, and take that and imagine it as a fireplace at, in the winter, and you have a cup of hot coffee, and you remind yourself you have this one life and these precious moments, and you just move that fire image into something really beautiful, or something really funny, or something really playful, because we need to make some new associations to those fear symbols that you got before you even had words. So we'll do some of that work to see what symbols we're working with. Another thing that we'll do is just inner child work in general. It sounds schizophrenic. We don't do this with teenagers. We only do this in adulthood. You have to have kind of more of a solid sense of self to do inner child work and shadow work. But you really remember and bring up in your memories, because your brain has a hard time of knowing what's real and what's not, and we use this to our advantage. And it's very effective. In fact, there's some studies we saw out of Germany that showed that narcissists, really hard to work with in therapy, but if you can talk to the child who had to put on the narcissistic personality, you can actually get them headway with even narcissists. So it's really powerful work. You imagine the child who was scared of hell, who was scared of losing their family, whatever it was, and you as an adult become parent in that situation. Hey, that wasn't okay. Hey, come here. Give yourself a little hug. And you do lots of visualization work. Remember time that you realized as a child, and you reparent yourself. Another really powerful exercise is like
the kind that only happens when someone somewhere realizes they just miscalculated you on a catastrophic scale. Because while you're sitting there pretending to be normal, pretending to behave, pretending to shrink yourself into shapes that don't belong to you, the NSA caught one microscopic glimpse of the real thing hiding under your skin. And darling, whatever they saw, it made professionals, people who spend their entire lives tracking monsters, criminals, warlords, ghosts, slam their fists on the "this is the end" button, like terrified interns who accidentally opened a file they shouldn't have.
Suck my
You know why?
motherfucking dick.
Because you weren't supposed to have that in you. Not yet. Not now. Not ever. They study patterns. You break them. They track anomalies. You are one. They monitor threats. You don't move like a threat. You move like the answer to one. And that's the part they can't process. The paradox that shouldn't exist. You're both the saint in daylight and the psychopath in the shadows. The angel who heals and the demon who finishes. The warning and the consequence. The prophecy and...
Suck my motherfucking dick.
Roughly 1 part in 100,000. To a cosmologist, this near uniformity is beautiful. It is confirmation that the early universe was smooth, well-mixed, and isotropic, exactly as the equations require. But the tiny variations, the subtle patches of hot and cold, are not random noise. They are the fingerprints of quantum fluctuations from the first trillionth of a second of existence, stretched across the sky by the expansion of the universe. They are the seeds that eventually grew into every galaxy, every star, every planet, every atom of your body. And when scientists began to study these variations with the precision that modern satellites could provide, they found something that should not be there. The tool they used is called multipole expansion. Think of it as breaking a complex sound into its individual notes. The cosmic microwave background is like a chord played on a cosmic instrument. Multipole expansion separates that chord into its component frequencies. The first note is the dipole, a simple hot on one side, cold on the other pattern, caused by the motion of our galaxy through space at roughly 370 kilometers per second. Scientists subtract this out. It is a known local effect. It tells us nothing about the universe at large. The next note is the quadrupole. This represents the temperature pattern on the largest possible scale, dividing the sky into 4 broad regions of hot and cold. After that comes the octopole, which divides the sky into 8 regions. In a universe that began with random quantum fluctuations inflated to cosmic size, these two patterns should have absolutely nothing to do with each other. They were set during different moments of the inflationary epoch. They are products of independent quantum processes. There is no physical mechanism in the standard model that would cause them to be aligned. Expecting the quadrupole and the octopole to point in the same direction is like expecting two strangers on opposites.
God damn it. God damn it. God damn it. God damn it. God damn it.
Grimlock. If you know one Dinobot, it's this one. Grimlock is the king, the leader, the most iconic Transformer who isn't Optimus Prime, and the guy who has made every other Dinobot possible by existing. In Generation 1, he transforms into a mechanical Tyrannosaurus Rex, breathes fire, hits harder than almost anything in Cybertron, and talks like he ate a dictionary and spat out only the words he found useless. Me Grimlock. Me no like Autobots. Me Grimlock King. That speech pattern isn't stupidity, and this is where his character gets genuinely interesting. Depending on the continuity, Grimlock is actually one of the most